"You can't afford this," the store clerk sneered, her eyes lingering on the girl's scuffed sneakers. But when her father walked in, the silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was unforgettable. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. The boutique smelled faintly of jasmine and polished wood, the kind of scent that whispered luxury before a single price tag was seen. Soft lighting spilled from crystal chandeliers, catching on sequined gowns displayed like constellations across velvet mannequins. Every surface gleamed, every shadow felt intentional, and right in the middle of it all stood Emily, 12 years old, small for her age, sneakers scuffed and sagging like they'd already lived 100 lives. The white rubber edges had gone gray from sidewalks and playground dust. The mismatched laces, one neon pink, one frayed blue, were tied in knots only she could understand. In her hand she held a necklace, not the flashiest piece in the boutique, not one of the dripping diamond cascades locked behind glass. Just a simple chain of gold with a small heart-shaped pendant, the kind that seemed almost too quiet for a place that thrived on spectacle. She didn't touch it carelessly. Her fingertips barely brushed the curve of the pendant, like she was afraid her breath alone might tarnish it. To Emily, it wasn't metal. It was light captured, a secret wish she hadn't dared to put into words. Across the counter, the clerk watched. She had the kind of sharp beauty that demanded attention. Nails polished in deep crimson, hair pulled into a sleek bun, lips painted with a shade that screamed power. She'd spent the morning folding scarves worth more than Emily's entire wardrobe. And now here was this girl in shoes that squeaked against marble floors, holding something that didn't belong in her hands. The clerk's mouth twitched, then curved into a smile that was more blade than kindness. "Sweetheart," she drawled, leaning over the counter, her voice low but not soft. "This isn't a thrift store. You can't afford this." The words cracked against Emily's ears like glass shattering. She froze, fingers stiffening against the chain. For a moment she thought maybe she hadn't heard right. Maybe the clerk was joking. But then she saw the tilt of her smirk, the way her eyes flicked deliberately to Emily's shoes and back again, and she knew. Heat flooded her cheeks. It spread to her ears, her neck, until her whole body hummed with a shame that felt too big for her skin. She wanted to melt into the marble floor, slip between the cracks, vanish into the reflections of crystal chandeliers. She wanted to be invisible, because invisible hurt less than this. Around her, the boutique shifted. A woman clutching a handbag paused, eyes darting to Emily, then away, as though contact might stain her. Two teenagers in matching designer hoodies giggled into their palms, whispers slipping out like smoke. A man pretending to study a row of cufflinks shook his head, not with cruelty, but with that subtle judgment adults reserve for children who dare to stand where they're not invited. The moment sliced Emily open, but she didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that. Her throat burned, her eyes pricked, but she held it in. Instead, she placed the necklace back on the counter carefully, reverently, like returning a relic to an altar. Her hand trembled, but she didn't drop it. She made sure it lay flat against the velvet pad, untangled, unmarred, because beauty deserved respect, even if she wasn't allowed to touch it. "I just wanted to see it up close," she whispered. Her voice barely carried, but it was enough. The clerk heard, everyone did. The clerk rolled her eyes, long lashes sweeping like curtains closing. "Of course you did," she muttered, already turning away, already dismissing the child like she was nothing more than dust tracked in on broken sneakers. Emily stood for a moment longer, her hand lingering on the counter, as though some part of her could still claim the warmth of the necklace, the shimmer it had left behind on her skin. Then slowly, she let go, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed. She turned toward the door, sneakers squeaking once more, carrying her out of a place that had just reminded her, in the cruelest way possible, that she didn't belong. But the necklace wasn't what she'd remember most. It was the laughter that wasn't loud but still cut like a knife. It was the clerk's smirk, the rolled eyes, the unspoken message echoing louder than chandeliers and glass shelves ever could. You don't matter here. Emily didn't know it yet, but someone else had just walked in, and he had heard enough. Emily didn't run. Running would have admitted something had broken. Instead, she moved slowly, each step measured, her sneakers whispering against the marble floor as if apologizing for their own existence. Her shoulders curled inward, her chin dipped, and she tried to shrink herself small enough to disappear between the racks of silk dresses and mirrored shelves. The boutique had always seemed intimidating, but now it felt cruel. Every polished tile gleamed brighter, reflecting back her scuffed shoes like a spotlight she hadn't asked for. Each shimmering gown draped in perfect lighting felt like a reminder that she didn't belong. By the shoe section, two girls about her age giggled over sparkling heels perched on white stands. They clutched glossy shopping bags with bold designer names stamped across them, trophies of belonging. Their laughter wasn't aimed at her, not directly, but it didn't have to be. Emily felt the weight of it all the same. It pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating. She tugged at her sleeve and let her fingers find the bracelet on her wrist. Thin fraying threads woven together in fading colors, knotted too many times to count. Her best friend had made it for her last summer at camp, promising, "This way, we're always together." To anyone else, it was nothing. To Emily, it was treasure. She wasn't angry, not yet. Anger required energy, fire. What she felt was colder, heavier, familiar. The quiet sting of being underestimated, brushed aside, unseen. This wasn't the first time. It likely wouldn't be the last. And maybe that was what made her chest ache most of all. Not the insult itself, but the fact that she was already used to it, like slipping into a coat that never fit but was always waiting. The boutique door loomed ahead. She pushed it open, the golden handle cold beneath her palm, and the city rushed in all at once. The buzz of traffic, the calls of street vendors, hawking roasted nuts and hot dogs, the bark of a taxi horn impatient at a crosswalk. Life was still happening, unbothered by the quiet humiliation that clung to her like static. She stepped out, the heavy glass door closing slowly behind her, sealing the boutique back into its world of chandeliers and sneers. Inside, the clerk let out a sigh sharp enough to cut glass. "Finally," she muttered under her breath, loud enough to feel like one last shove out the door. She turned her back, satisfied, already smoothing her skirt as if shaking off the presence of the child who'd dared to touch what wasn't hers. But she didn't notice the shadow that stretched across the polished floor just then. Broad, steady, deliberate, it filled the doorway in silence, commanding without trying. Emily's father stepped into the boutique at that very moment, and though his footsteps were quiet, the air shifted. People glanced up instinctively, sensing something in the room had changed. He hadn't come to shop. He hadn't come to browse glittering cases or touch silk worth more than a week's wages. He had come to find his daughter, and in the seconds before his eyes landed on her retreating figure outside, he had already heard enough. The mocking tone, the dismissive laugh, the final word dripping with contempt. He carried it with him, heavy and sharp. Emily didn't see the way people turned toward the door, how spines straightened when they noticed the figure who'd entered. She was already halfway down the sidewalk, blending into the crowd, clutching her bracelet like it was armor. She thought she was walking away alone, smaller than when she had come in. What she didn't know, not yet, was that she had left a storm behind her, one that had just stepped through the boutique's shining glass doors. David stepped through the door with the kind of quiet that made people look up without knowing why. He wasn't the kind of man boutiques were built for. His jeans were faded at the knees, his jacket worn thin at the elbows, the kind of clothes that told the truth of long days rather than cocktail hours. But it didn't matter. He carried something more than fabric could disguise. His eyes, dark, steady, unflinching, drew a line across the room that everyone felt. It wasn't money, it wasn't status. It was presence, carved from years of weather harder than marble floors or sparkling chandeliers. The first thing he saw was Emily. Just outside the glass doors, her small frame pressed into the current of the sidewalk crowd, her shoulders hunched, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were pale. Her face burned red, the kind of flush that wasn't from play or laughter, but from being cut open by words sharper than knives. He didn't need to hear what had been said. He knew. A father always knows. Then his gaze shifted, slow, deliberate, to the clerk. She froze for half a second, caught mid-adjustment of her perfect crimson nails. Something in his eyes unspooled the confidence from her posture. Her smirk wavered, though she quickly pasted on a smile polished enough for display. "Is there a problem here?" His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, but beneath it ran something heavier, something that made the air thicken. The clerk straightened, letting out a laugh that landed too sharp. "Not at all, sir. Just assisting customers." He didn't step closer. He didn't need proximity to command space. He stood where he was, tall, grounded, unshaken, and said, "Funny because my daughter doesn't look assisted. She looks humiliated." The boutique seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Somewhere in the corner, a zipper was pulled too quickly on a garment bag, the sound cutting through the silence like static. A woman flipping through dresses slowed her hand. A man inspecting cufflinks suddenly found them far less interesting. Everyone was pretending to browse, but their ears tilted toward the words hanging heavy in the room. The clerk blinked, caught off balance. Her fake smile stretched too wide. "Sir, you misunderstand. The young lady was lingering near merchandise beyond her means. We have to maintain certain—" David's eyes narrowed just slightly, enough to stop her mid-sentence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Certain what?" The question came like stone laid down on marble, each word deliberate. The clerk's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Standards," she finished weakly, though the word seemed to wilt the moment it left her mouth. David's jaw tightened. He didn't look around to see who was watching, but he knew. The weight of their attention pressed in, the way it always does when the powerful are questioned by someone who isn't supposed to speak. Still, he stood steady, every line of his body saying he wasn't going anywhere. "Standards," he repeated softly, like the word tasted bitter. His gaze flicked to the necklace still lying on the velvet pad, abandoned, gleaming under perfect light. Then back to the woman. "You think humiliating a child meets your standards?" No one moved. Not the clerk, not the shoppers. The boutique, all glass and polish, all whispers and curated light, had become a stage. And David Hollis had just stepped into the center without ever asking for the part. The clerk's polished composure faltered, but she clung to it like a mask. Her lips pressed into something meant to resemble authority, though the edges curled with unease. "Sir," she began, each syllable sharpened to sound official. She was touching merchandise that's delicate. "We get certain types who—" Her voice snagged on the words, and for a fraction of a second she hesitated. She realized she had said too much, and yet said everything. The implication hung in the air, sour and undeniable. David took a step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, but steady enough that the marble beneath his boots seemed to echo louder than the boutique music playing faintly in the background. His voice was low, softer than before, but there was steel beneath it, the kind of weight that made even silence lean in to listen. "Certain types like what?" His eyes didn't blink. "Children? Or people you think don't belong here?" The clerk's jaw stiffened, but her eyes betrayed her. For a flicker of a moment she looked away. That was all it took. The line between confidence and fear is thin, and David had just stepped her over it. Emily tugged on his sleeve, small fingers bunching the fabric of his worn jacket. Her voice was so faint it could have been mistaken for a sigh. "Dad, it's okay." She looked up at him, her wide eyes begging for this to pass, for him not to draw more fire. She wanted to leave with dignity, not attention, but for David, it wasn't okay. Not now. Not after seeing the way her cheeks still glowed with the fresh sting of humiliation. not after watching her retreat into herself as though she needed to be smaller to survive. He couldn't let this moment become another scar she carried silently. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing his height down to hers, shutting out the curious stares of strangers for a moment so the world shrank to just the two of them. His voice was calm, gentle, stripped of the steel it carried moments ago. "You wanted to see something, right?" Emily hesitated, her teeth catching her bottom lip, but she nodded faintly. It was the smallest of gestures, but it was brave. David's hand brushed her shoulder, steadying her like an anchor. "Then we'll see it," he said, his tone quiet but certain. He stood again, taller than before, not because of his height, but because of the unshakable conviction running through him. He turned to the clerk, his expression cut from stone. "Show her the necklace." The clerk let out a sound that was half scoff, half laugh, though it cracked under pressure. "It's several $1,000s," she said, her voice sharp but quivering at the edges. "There's no point." David didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on hers, unwavering, steady, as if carved from something older than marble or chandeliers. "I didn't ask the price," he said. His voice carried through the boutique, quiet yet filling every corner. "I asked you to show her." The room stilled. The air seemed to press in on itself. Shoppers froze in place, dresses suspended mid-hanger, credit cards held motionless in manicured hands. The music playing overhead became background noise, irrelevant against the weight of this moment. For the first time, the clerk, perfectly manicured, perfectly poised, looked out of place in her own store. Emily stood beside her father, her small frame tucked into his shadow, but for the first time since walking into the boutique, she didn't feel invisible. All around them the chandeliers still shimmered, the glass shelves still gleamed, but the spotlight had shifted. It wasn't on sequined gowns or glittering jewels. It was on a girl in worn sneakers, and a father who refused to let her believe she was less. The clerk moved as though each step was punishment. Her heels clicked too sharply against the marble, her jaw clenched tight enough to leave marks. With a sigh sharp enough to slice glass, she unlocked the case and retrieved the necklace. Her manicured fingers, usually so practiced, now felt clumsy as she set it down on the velvet pad. She slid it across the counter with the detached air of someone delivering a bill rather than something meant to dazzle us all. Her smile, if it could be called that, was brittle and insincere, the corners of her lips pulling against her will. Emily's breath caught. The necklace lay before her now, no longer just a glimmer behind glass, but close enough that she could see the way the gold, curved like sunlight, poured into metal. The tiny heart pendant wasn't loud, not dripping in jewels, but it glowed as if it held its own quiet fire. She didn't reach for it, not yet. She just stood there, small and still, her wide eyes drinking it in the way a thirsty soul drinks water. Her chest rose and fell, as though even breathing too close might make it vanish. David watched her, his face softening in a way that rarely happened in front of strangers. The lines on his face, carved from years of strain, eased for just a moment. He wasn't looking at the gold. He was looking at his daughter, the wonder in her eyes, the innocence untouched by greed, the kind of awe people forget how to feel once the world teaches them cynicism. The corners of his mouth lifted faintly. "Do you like it?" he asked quietly. His voice wasn't coaxing, just curious, like he wanted to give her permission to feel. Emily's cheeks flushed. She lifted her shoulders in a small shrug, embarrassed under so many unseen eyes. "It's pretty," she admitted softly, "but I didn't mean to—" Her voice trailed off, swallowed by the weight of apology that children learn too soon. David shook his head gently, a firmness in his tone that didn't scold her, only corrected the lie she was trying to tell herself. "You don't need to apologize for wanting to see beauty up close." The words didn't shout, but they cut through the boutique sharper than the clerk's insult had moments earlier. They carried farther than he realized. Customers nearby paused. A woman folding a silk scarf froze mid-crease, her eyes flicking toward the counter. A man holding a suit jacket tilted his head slightly, his lips pressing together in thought. Two young women near the shoe display exchanged a glance, one of them giving the faintest nod, as though she wanted to clap but didn't dare. The silence was charged now, no longer cruel, but contemplative. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wet with something she couldn't quite name. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her hand. Her fingertips brushed against the pendant, feather-light, tracing the curve of the heart as though memorizing it by touch. Her lips parted, just barely, as though the necklace had whispered to her. It wasn't the price tag or the gold that captured her. It was that for once she was allowed to want something without shame. David stood beside her, steady as a mountain. He didn't look at the clerk. He didn't look at the watching customers. His gaze was fixed only on Emily, and in that moment, the boutique wasn't marble and mirrors and chandeliers. It was just a father and a daughter, and the simple, sacred act of giving a child permission to wonder. The clerk shifted behind the counter, her hands twitching at her sides, her forced smile cracking further. She had meant to belittle, to shrink the girl down until she disappeared. But now the girl stood taller, not in height, but in spirit, her small hand resting on a necklace that seemed to shine brighter because she touched it without fear. The hush in the room deepened, and though no one dared to speak, the truth was clear. The most valuable thing in that boutique wasn't behind glass or laid out on velvet. It was standing right there, in worn sneakers, holding her father's faith like it was the most precious jewel of all. David's eyes stayed on Emily, but his thoughts slipped somewhere else, pulled backward like a tide he couldn't stop. The way she stood now, small shoulders tense, cheeks still pink from the sting of someone's words, mirrored another moment, another lifetime. He could see her mother standing in a store not so different from this one. The same polished marble floors, the same mannequins, dressed in gowns no one ever actually wore outside of magazine pages. She had been younger then, smiling at a pair of shoes displayed under soft lights. They were simple, white with a gentle curve, nothing extravagant. But the price tag was more than rent. He remembered the way she'd laughed, tugging on his sleeve, whispering, "Glass slippers. Guess I'm Cinderella, except this prince can't afford the ball." They had joked together, spinning fairy tales out of the absurdity of it all. Back then, they thought time was endless. Back then, he believed there would always be another chance, another store, another day to buy her the shoes she deserved. But she never wore them. She never wore anything new again. Her laughter was cut short in a hospital bed, and David had been left holding promises that turned into ash. He swallowed hard now, the memory pressing like a stone in his throat. He had vowed that Emily would never know that feeling, that kind of less than, that kind of smallness in a world that measured worth by receipts. He had sworn he'd shield her from it, build walls high enough to keep out the cruelty, teach her to walk tall even when the ground itself tried to tilt against her. Yet here she stood, flushed with humiliation, clutching her hands together as though holding herself in place. And it broke something deep inside him, something he had patched together over the years with sheer will. The rage came quietly, not wild, not reckless, but humming low and steady, like a furnace that had burned too long without being tended. His jaw tightened, his chest rose with controlled breath, and for a moment he thought of how easy it would be to unleash it, to roar, to shame, to strip this place of its polished pride. But anger was cheap. It scattered fast and left nothing behind but smoke. No, this wasn't the time for anger. This was the time for something sharper. He leaned closer to the counter. The clerk stiffened instinctively, her hands flattening against the velvet pad, as though bracing for a blow she couldn't name. David's voice didn't rise. If anything, it dropped lower, steadier, but the weight in it pressed harder than any shout could have. "Do you know what it costs to humiliate a child?" The question landed heavy. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a ledger opening. invisible but undeniable, laying bare numbers the clerk could never tally. Her eyes flickered nervously, caught in his stare. He didn't let her look away. "More than you'll ever make in commission." The words cut through the boutique, slicing past chandeliers and soft music, stripping away the illusion of wealth as protection. They rang louder than the clerk's earlier sneer, louder than the whispers that had filled the air moments before. For a heartbeat, the entire store seemed to pause, the atmosphere shifting from polished indifference to something closer to shame. David straightened slowly, his expression unreadable, but his presence unshakable. He wasn't a man in worn jeans and an old jacket anymore. He was a father standing at the edge of the one promise he could not let himself break again. Emily looked up at him, eyes wide, and though she didn't understand everything behind the words, she felt the strength in them. The clerk, on the other hand, seemed smaller now, as if the ground she stood on wasn't as firm as it had been moments ago. And in the silence that followed, the truth lingered like a shadow. Worth was not measured in silk or gold, but in how one human being treated another. And no commission in the world could cover the cost of what she had just tried to take from his daughter. The boutique had stopped breathing. What began as quiet glances had grown into open stares. Customers who once pretended to fuss over hangers or price tags now stood still, their curiosity too strong to disguise. A couple near the fitting rooms leaned toward each other, whispering, their voices swallowed by the tension hanging in the air. Near the back, a young sales associate froze mid-fold of a cashmere sweater, her hands suspended as if she feared even the fabric might betray her by making a sound. The music playing overhead, once a soft and forgettable backdrop, now felt like an intruder, too cheerful for the weight pressing down on the room. The clerk stiffened behind the counter, her posture sharp, her eyes darting to the customers as though silently pleading with them to return to their shopping and restore her power. She cleared her throat, grasping at the last thread of control. "Sir," she said tightly, "if you'd like to make a purchase, you're welcome to, but if not—" David cut her off, not with volume but with presence. The kind of presence that makes air thinner, that steals the oxygen from a room without anyone understanding why they're suddenly holding their breath. He didn't raise his voice, but every syllable landed like a stone. "You think this is about a purchase?" The words hung heavy, echoing louder than chandeliers deserved. His eyes swept across the boutique, not rushing, not accusing, but steady, forcing everyone to confront the weight of what he was saying. "You think her worth, her curiosity, is measured in dollars?" The question was bigger than the clerk. It was bigger than the store. It was the kind of question that stripped away velvet displays and glass cases until all that was left was something raw and human. Emily bit her lip hard, trying to hold herself still, trying not to let the tears that burned at the edges of her eyes slip free. She didn't want to make this worse. She didn't want to be the center of a storm. But David noticed. He always noticed. His voice softened as he turned to her, though it carried just as clearly. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "show me your shoes." Emily hesitated, her face hot, her throat tight. She wanted to refuse, to shake her head, to disappear into the floor, but her father's eyes steadied her, not demanding, not pushing, inviting. Slowly she lifted her foot just enough for everyone to see. The sneaker sagged at the sides, its rubber edge frayed and gray. One lace was knotted 3 times to keep it from splitting apart. The other was threadbare, its color long gone. They were the kind of shoes that carried stories no one bothered to hear. David nodded, his gaze never leaving her. Then he spoke, his voice filling the boutique like a hymn. "They're strong shoes," he said, and though he spoke to her, the words were meant for everyone. "They've carried her farther than diamonds ever could." The room shifted. You could feel it. The clerk's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Customers who had once smirked now stood straighter, as if ashamed of how quickly they'd judged. The young associate lowered the sweater she'd been folding, her eyes wet but fixed on Emily. Even the couple near the fitting rooms had gone silent, no longer whispering, just watching, their expressions softening. Emily's cheek still burned, but the sting was different now. It wasn't humiliation. It was something closer to pride, fragile but real, stitched carefully into her chest by her father's words. She lowered her foot back to the floor, standing a little taller than before, her shoulders not quite as hunched. David remained steady, rooted like a tree in the center of polished marble. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't moved much at all, but in that quiet steadiness, he had turned the boutique inside out. In a place that sold beauty by the ounce, he had reminded them that sometimes the most valuable thing walked in wearing worn-out sneakers, and still managed to shine brighter than the chandeliers above. The clerk scoffed, though it came out thinner than she intended. Her arms folded tightly across her chest, nails tapping against her sleeves, as if the sound alone might anchor her authority. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp, but already cracking at the edges, "with all due respect, this is a luxury store. We have standards." The words were gasoline poured over glowing embers. David didn't move much, only tilted his head slightly, but the shift carried weight. His eyes narrowed, steady as a blade being drawn. "Standards?" he repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. He gestured toward the necklace, still resting on the velvet pad, its golden heart gleaming under curated light. "That's metal and stone. Expensive, yes, but not valuable until someone gives it meaning. Standards," he continued, his voice even, resonant, "are how you treat people. Standards are whether you see a child as a nuisance or as a soul." His jaw tightened. "By those standards, you're bankrupt." The silence that followed cracked through the boutique like lightning. Even the soft music piped through hidden speakers seemed to falter, its delicate notes clashing against the truth that had just been spoken aloud. No one moved. No one breathed. Emily's wide eyes lifted to her father, her lips parted, but wordless. She had never seen him like this, not angry, not loud, but something else entirely. Fierce, yes, but controlled. A kind of strength that couldn't be pushed aside or ignored. To her, he looked unshakable, as if nothing in the glittering store could diminish him. Her chest swelled with something she hadn't expected to feel in that place. Pride. The clerk's confidence drained visibly, like sand slipping through an open fist. She shifted her weight, her arms unfolding, her gaze darting from David to the watching customers and back again. The fire she had sparked was now out of her control, and she knew it. Her lips parted as though to respond, but no words came. Then, from near the door, a sound broke the stillness, a single pair of hands clapping, tentative and awkward, but impossible to ignore. Heads turned. The sound stopped. Then began again, louder this time. Another clap joined it, then another, until the quiet was broken by a ripple of applause that spread through the boutique like a wave. It wasn't thunderous at first. It was uneven, hesitant, like people testing the boundaries of their own courage. But within moments, it grew undeniable. The couple near the fitting rooms clapped softly, then firmly. The young associate, who had frozen with a half-folded sweater, dropped it onto the counter and clapped with both hands, her eyes shining. Even the man who had earlier pretended to study cufflinks raised his palms and let them meet, the sound echoing against the glass cases. The clerk paled, standing stiff and exposed in the middle of it all. For once, she wasn't in control of the narrative. She wasn't the voice shaping the moment. She was the one being measured and found wanting. David didn't smile. He didn't bask in it. He stood as he was, quiet and steady, his hand resting gently on Emily's shoulder. The applause wasn't for him, it was for her, for the girl who had been mocked, dismissed, belittled, yet now stood taller because her father had refused to let her shrink. Emily blinked rapidly, her eyes wet, but refusing to let tears fall. She pressed her lips together, fighting a tremor in her chin. And though she didn't say a word, she felt it deep inside. The necklace wasn't the treasure in the room. She was. The clapping swelled, filling the boutique, bouncing off marble and chandeliers, turning the sterile air of wealth into something human. The clerk looked away, her jaw tight, her posture faltering, and for the first time since Emily had walked through the glass doors, she no longer felt like she didn't belong. She felt seen. She felt defended. She felt enough. David stood in the middle of the boutique as the applause softened, as the weight of the moment still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. He didn't acknowledge the clapping, didn't glance at the people whose eyes were still fixed on him. None of that mattered. He turned only to Emily, the world shrinking until it was just the two of them. "Do you want it?" he asked, his voice even, as though the question wasn't about gold or price tags at all. Emily's head shook quickly, her small hands tightening into fists at her sides. "Dad, it's too much," she whispered. The words were rushed, desperate, like she wanted to protect him from what she assumed was impossible. Her eyes darted to the clerk, to the customers still lingering, then back to the necklace glimmering on velvet. Shame and longing warred on her face. David lowered himself to one knee, patient, steady. The noise of the store dimmed further. "That's not what I asked," he said. Her throat tightened. She blinked fast, fighting tears she didn't want him to see. "I love it," she admitted finally, voice fragile. "But I don't need it." He nodded slowly, not with disappointment, not with relief, but with quiet recognition of the weight of her words. Then he rose to his full height, his eyes calm, and turned back to the clerk. "We'll take it." The boutique rippled with sound. Gasps slipped from parted lips. A woman clutched her handbag closer. Someone near the shoe section murmured, "Did he just—" The clerk's composure fractured. Her practiced mask fell, leaving only raw disbelief. "Sir, are you sure?" she stammered, her voice thinner than the air between them. David didn't bother answering her. His gaze went back to Emily, soft but firm. "Some things aren't bought," he said, the words carrying farther than he intended. "They're kept. They're passed down. And this—" He gestured toward the necklace, its small heart pendant catching the light. "This will remind you every time you wear it that no one decides your worth. Not shoes, not strangers, no one." Emily's breath shuddered. She blinked hard, her lashes damp, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not now. She pressed her lips together, her chest swelling with something she didn't yet have words for. Pride, relief, love, all tangled together. The clerk's hands trembled as she lifted the necklace from the velvet. For the first time that evening, her elegance deserted her. She fumbled with the box, nearly dropping the chain, before setting it inside and sliding it across the counter. Her fingers brushed against the register buttons with a stiffness that betrayed her unease. The ringing up of the purchase, normally routine, became something weighted, clumsy. Each beep of the scanner felt like a confession. The receipt printed slowly, the sound sharp and deliberate in the hushed room. She slid it forward along with the small bag, her hands shaking enough that the tissue paper crinkled too loudly. She couldn't meet David's eyes. She couldn't meet Emily's either. David took the bag but didn't look at it. His hand rested gently on Emily's back, guiding her closer to the counter, not so she could see the necklace again, but so she could see herself reflected in the glass. He wanted her to remember this moment, not as one of humiliation, but as one of reclamation, a place where she wasn't dismissed, but defended. The clerk muttered, "Thank you for your purchase," but the words carried no pride, no triumph, just a hollow echo. David gave no reply. He simply turned to Emily, offering her the bag as though it contained not jewelry, but proof of something deeper, that she was worth standing up for, worth protecting, worth celebrating. She took it carefully, holding it against her chest, her chin trembling. And though she didn't speak, the look in her eyes told him everything. She finally believed it. The receipt slid from the register with a mechanical hum, its sound slicing through the hush that had settled over the boutique. It was a small thing, paper spooling into the clerk's trembling hands, but in the silence it seemed louder than it had any right to be. And in that silence, Voices began to stir, hushed but impossible to ignore. "Who is he?" someone near the handbags whispered. "Did you see how he spoke?" another murmured, words laced with awe rather than gossip. The boutique was no longer a place of transactions and quiet pretenses. It had become a stage, and the man in worn jeans and a frayed jacket had commanded it without ever asking to. Customers glanced at one another, some embarrassed for having smirked earlier, others simply struck by the quiet authority that had overturned the room. The young associate, who had frozen earlier, sweater half folded in her hands, stepped forward now. Her movements were cautious, but her eyes were steady, kind. She carried with her a small velvet bag, the kind used to hold delicate trinkets. She crouched slightly to Emily's height and held it out. "For you," she said softly, her voice carrying no trace of condescension, only warmth. "No charge. Just because." Emily blinked in surprise, the glow of the overhead lights reflecting in her wide eyes. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was real, then reached out with both hands to take the bag. Her fingers brushed the young woman's, and she offered a shy smile, one that bloomed slowly but lit her face in a way no necklace ever could. David watched silently, the corners of his mouth softening. He gave the associate a small nod, one that carried more weight than any thank you spoken aloud. She returned it with a quiet dip of her head before stepping back, her gesture unnoticed by most, but not by Emily. Behind the counter, the clerk's cheeks burned red. Her eyes darted to the floor, to the register, to anywhere that wasn't the father and daughter standing before her. For the first time that evening, she wasn't the one admired, the one in control. The weight of every glance in the room pressed against her, and she shrank in its shadow. The balance of power had shifted. Not to money, not to prestige, but to dignity. Emily opened the velvet bag slowly, her hands careful, reverent. She tucked the necklace box inside, the tissue paper rustling softly, and then drew the strings tight. She held it close to her chest, not like a prize, not like something she was afraid might be stolen, but like something fragile, sacred. She stood straighter now, her small shoulders no longer slumped under invisible weight. Her chin lifted just slightly, enough to change the way she looked at herself in the reflection of the glass case beside her. She wasn't taller because of the jewelry, not really. She was taller because her father had reminded her of something the world had tried to take from her, that she mattered, that she was not invisible. Her father's words echoed silently inside her, "No one decides your worth, not shoes, not strangers." She looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw the steady truth of it. His hand rested gently on her back, guiding her not forward, not out, but upward, as though to remind her that her place in the world wasn't determined by the polish of her shoes, but by the strength of her spirit. For the first time since walking into the boutique, Emily didn't feel small. She didn't feel out of place. She felt seen. She felt enough, not because of a necklace, not because of applause, because she was his daughter. David's hand closed gently around Emily's, his grip steady, protective, but not suffocating. He pushed open the glass door, and together they stepped out into the city evening. The boutique doors swung shut behind them, a soft thud that sounded like the closing of more than just a store. It was the closing of a moment, one neither of them would ever forget. Inside, the ripple of what had just happened didn't vanish with their departure. It lingered like perfume clinging to fabric. Some customers were still whispering, their voices hushed but charged. A few had fallen silent altogether, their own reflections in polished glass catching them off guard, making them wonder how they had looked at the girl with the worn sneakers only minutes before. The clerk avoided every glance, her posture brittle, her pride cracked. Outside, the air felt different. It was crisp and cool, sharp with the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor and tinged with the faint exhaust of passing cars. Compared to the boutique's curated silence, the city's chaos was almost comforting. Horns blared in the distance, Someone shouted for a cab, and a street musician strummed a weathered guitar on the corner. The noise made Emily breathe easier, like the city was wrapping her in its messy, unpolished arms and reminding her she belonged to it more than she ever could to chandeliers and velvet displays. She squeezed her father's hand as they joined the flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk. The crowd parted easily around them, strangers brushing by with bags, briefcases, and hurried conversations. To Emily, though, none of it mattered as much as the warmth of her dad's palm against hers. She looked up at him, her voice small but steady. "Dad?" "Yeah?" His tone was gentle, almost distracted, like he already knew she was carrying something she needed to let out. "You didn't have to do that." The words tumbled from her, part gratitude, part worry. Her eyes flicked down at her sneakers, the ones that had carried her shame only minutes earlier, now squeaking faintly against the pavement with every step. David glanced down at her, his features softening in a way they rarely did out in public. His brow relaxed, his mouth curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something warmer, deeper. "Maybe I did," he said quietly. His voice carried weight, not like his words in the store, which had cut through air like steel, but like something older, gentler, forged in years of promises he'd made to himself. He squeezed her hand. "For me as much as for you." Emily tilted her head, her brows drawing together. She didn't fully understand, not yet. She could sense the layers in his words, feel the unspoken ache beneath them, but she didn't press. She just nodded, the way children do when they're holding on to trust they can't quite explain. They walked on together, weaving through the tide of strangers, the necklace tucked safely in her bag, and the memory of the boutique tucked even deeper inside her. Every squeak of her sneakers against the pavement reminded her of something new, something she hadn't dared believe before. For the first time in a long time, she didn't wish for different shoes. She didn't wish for polished leather or glittering heels like the girls inside had clutched in their glossy shopping bags. She looked down at her scuffed soles. The mismatched laces knotted too many times, and she felt taller, stronger, because her father had seen her, because he had made everyone else see her too. And as they disappeared into the rhythm of the city, hand in hand, Emily realized that sometimes the world doesn't change all at once. Sometimes it only shifts a little, just enough to make you believe you're not invisible anymore. The kitchen smelled of garlic and tomatoes, steam rising in soft curls from the pot on the stove. The space was small, walls close and familiar, the hum of the refrigerator steady in the background. It was nothing like the boutique's polished marble or chandeliers, but it was theirs. And tonight, on the center of the worn wooden table, sat the necklace box. Its velvet corners caught the light of the overhead lamp, glowing faintly like it had been set there to watch over them. Emily hadn't touched it since they walked in. She placed it carefully, almost reverently, and now she sat staring at it as though it might open on its own. David moved easily in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, humming while he stirred the sauce. The tune was soft, weaving between the bubbling pot and the clink of the ladle against its rim. Emily recognized it immediately. She'd heard it long ago, back when nights smelled of bedtime stories and her mother's perfume. It was the lullaby her mother used to sing when the world felt too big for a little girl to sleep in. She leaned back in her chair, listening. For a moment the apartment didn't feel small. It felt safe. "Do you miss her?" The words slipped from Emily before she realized she'd spoken them. They cut through the hum, the bubbling, the gentle rhythm of the room. David froze, the ladle heavy in his hand. The question hung between them, fragile and full. He turned slowly, and Emily saw the way his eyes had shifted, weighed down with something she knew he carried, but rarely spoke of. He leaned against the counter, silent for a beat too long, then finally let the truth out. "Every day." His voice wasn't cracked. It was steady, but it carried the ache of someone who had learned to live with a missing piece. "But when I see you stand tall," he added, his gaze resting on her. "I feel like she's here again." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She looked at the box on the table, still closed, still glowing softly under the yellow kitchen light. Her fingers twitched against the edge of her chair. Slowly, with a breath that trembled more than she wanted it to, she reached out and lifted the lid. The necklace glittered instantly, catching the light in ways that made it seem alive. Gold curved delicately, the heart pendant sparkling like it had stored a secret flame inside. But Emily didn't see the metal. She didn't see the cost or the shimmer. She saw her father's reflection in it, his steady face mirrored in the polished surface, unshakable even in the quiet of their tiny kitchen. The pendant framed him like a reminder that he was her anchor, that he had stood when others tried to make her small. David came over, setting the ladle down, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He didn't reach for the necklace. He didn't need to. He stood beside her, close enough for his warmth to chase away the lingering chill of the boutique. Emily looked up at him, her lips pressing together to keep her voice steady. "It's pretty," she whispered. "It's more than that," he replied softly. His hand brushed her shoulder, grounding her. "It's a promise. Not from the store, from me, that you'll never forget who you are." Emily nodded, closing the box gently, as if to seal not just the necklace inside, but the moment, the words, the weight of what had passed between them. The kitchen light hummed, the sauce bubbled, and in the middle of their modest little home, the necklace sat like a beacon, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. She didn't need chandeliers or marble floors. She had this. She had him. And tonight, that was enough. The morning sun slipped through the classroom windows in thin, pale stripes, landing across Emily's desk as she sat down. The necklace lay cool against her skin, hidden beneath the fabric of her sweater, close enough that she could feel its small weight with every breath. She hadn't put it on to show anyone. She wasn't the kind of girl who liked attention. But it felt different, wearing it. It was like carrying a secret reminder, one only she and her father knew the meaning of. At lunch, her best friend Maddie noticed first. They were unwrapping sandwiches at their usual spot near the edge of the cafeteria when Maddie leaned forward, her eyes widening, as a glint of gold slipped into view from beneath Emily's sweater collar. "Oh my gosh," Maddie whispered, her voice half gasp, half squeal. "Where'd you get that?" Emily's fingers immediately went to the pendant, tucking it back under her sweater, her face heating. She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't sound like bragging, that wouldn't make her feel small again. Finally, she shrugged lightly, her voice quiet. "My dad got it for me." Maddie didn't tease, didn't question the way some of the other kids might have. She just tilted her head, studying Emily the way only a best friend could. After a long pause, she smiled, soft and certain. "It looks like it belongs to you." The words landed differently than the whispers in the boutique had. They weren't sharp. They didn't cut. They soothed, filling some hidden hollow inside her with warmth. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and managed a small smile back. All through the rest of the day, the necklace stayed tucked away, but somehow everyone seemed to notice something different about her anyway. Not because she flaunted it, not because she wanted them to see, but because she carried herself taller. The shy hunch in her shoulders wasn't there in the same way. She raised her hand in class without shrinking. She walked down the hallway without wishing she could disappear. In math class, while numbers blurred on the board and the teacher droned on about fractions, Emily drifted into her own world. She pulled her notebook closer and began to doodle in the corner of a page. Not hearts, not the necklace, not even the chandeliers she remembered from the boutique. She drew shoes, her shoes, scuffed, laces frayed, soles worn thin from sidewalks and playgrounds, but this time she didn't draw them to mock them. She didn't shade in the stains or exaggerate the tears. She drew them strong, bold lines shaping them like they had purpose. Shoes that had carried her this far and would carry her farther still. She looked down at the sketch when she was finished and felt something stir. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like the girl with old sneakers. She didn't feel like she had to measure herself against kids with shiny new things. She felt seen, not because of what she wore, but because of what she carried. Her father's words, his presence, his reminder that worth wasn't something the world gave you. It was something you owned deep inside. Emily closed her notebook gently, the drawing tucked away like another secret, and rested her hand over her sweater, where the necklace pressed softly against her heart. A quiet smile curved her lips. The shoes in her drawing might have been worn, but they were hers. They were strong. And, just like her father said, they had already carried her farther than diamonds ever could. The office in the back of the boutique was smaller than it looked from the outside. The walls were painted the same sleek ivory as the showroom, but in here, the gloss dulled. Stacks of paperwork leaned against the corners of the manager's desk, and the faint buzz of the overhead fluorescent light made the space feel less like luxury and more like a waiting room. The clerk sat stiffly in one of the chairs, her arms crossed tight across her chest, though her hands wouldn't stay still. Her nails, painted in deep crimson that usually made her feel untouchable, tapped nervously against her sleeve. Across from her, the manager flipped through notes, his brow furrowed deeper with each page. He cleared his throat and read out loud fragments of the reviews that had already surfaced online, words that pierced sharper than any customer complaint she had dealt with before. Rude, disrespectful, humiliated a child. Each one dropped heavy into the room, stacking into a pile she couldn't look away from. "I was just following policy," she muttered quickly, leaning forward. "Judd, we can't let anyone, especially children, handle merchandise without supervision. That necklace was worth thousands. If something happened—" The manager raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His eyes weren't cruel, but they weren't sympathetic either. "No one's arguing policy," he said evenly. "We're talking about judgment, about compassion, about the way you represent this store." He tapped the paper with a finger. "You didn't just turn away a customer. You made a scene. You made people question whether this place has any heart at all." Her mouth opened, then closed again. Words hovered but refused to come. She wanted to insist she had done the right thing, that protecting the merchandise was protecting the store, but the image of the girl's flushed face wouldn't leave her. Those old sneakers, those wide eyes, the way her father's voice had cut through the air like steel wrapped in truth. It all clung to her. The manager sighed, softer this time. "Take a few days off," he said finally. "Think about how this happened. Think about how it looked. We'll talk again next week." Dismissed, she rose slowly, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. The confidence she usually carried out of habit felt like a coat she couldn't find the sleeves to anymore. She walked out of the boutique into the night, the city air colder than she expected. The streets were alive as always, horns blaring, neon signs buzzing, vendors shouting. But for the first time she noticed the children. They weren't dressed in silk or polished shoes. Their sneakers were worn, some untied, some scuffed, some nearly splitting at the sides. Their parents held their hands tightly as they crossed intersections, talking, laughing, some carrying paper bags instead of designer purses. None of them looked like they belonged in her boutique world, and yet there was something in their faces she couldn't dismiss. She slowed her pace, watching a little boy tug his mother toward a cart selling roasted peanuts, his sneakers squeaking as he skipped across the sidewalk. She thought of Emily, the way the girl had whispered, "I just wanted to see it up close." The words replayed, softer now, heavier. She had dismissed them so easily, brushed them off like dirt on marble. But maybe she hadn't heard them for what they were, not a request for ownership, but for wonder. Her chest tightened. The city lights blurred slightly as her eyes stung, though she blinked quickly, refusing to let them fall. She had spent years believing her job was to guard beauty, to protect it behind glass and velvet. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered if she had been guarding it from the very people who needed it most. By the time she reached her apartment building, she felt smaller than she had in years. Smaller, but not in the way she had once looked down on others. This smallness felt like an unraveling, a humbling. She unlocked her door quietly, the sound of children's laughter still echoing in her head. And though she didn't yet know what she would do with the unease clawing at her, she knew one thing for certain. Something inside her had shifted. Maybe for the first time she had been wrong, not about rules, not about policy, about people. And maybe that was the beginning of something changing. Saturday morning carried the quiet hum of routine. The smell of coffee drifted through the small apartment, mingling with the faint crackle of bacon in the pan. Sunlight streamed in through the blinds, striping the kitchen table in pale gold. David sat in his usual chair, shoulders still heavy with the week, but softened by the warmth of home. Emily moved differently that morning, nervous energy in her steps, her small hands hidden behind her back. She had been working in secret for days, using scraps from school projects and the bottom of her supply drawer, guarding it with the kind of focus only a child determined to surprise could muster. Now, she stood by the table, her heart pounding. "Dad?" she asked, her voice cautious. He looked up from his mug, his eyes softening. "Yeah, kiddo?" She pulled it from behind her back and placed it on the table in front of him. A handmade frame, edges crafted from old cardboard she had cut carefully with safety scissors. Glitter glue lined the borders unevenly, catching the morning light in flashes of blue and gold. Inside she had slipped a sketch, her sketch. David froze, the mug halfway to his lips. His eyes lowered to the drawing. It was simple but powerful. 2 sneakers, worn but strong, drawn with pencil lines that captured every fray and crease. Next to them, his hand, large and steady, wrapped around hers, small and certain. Between them, glowing like a star, the necklace. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, she had written, "Worth isn't what we wear, it's who we walk with." The words landed heavier than anything he had heard in years. His throat tightened, a lump swelling fast, too stubborn to swallow. He stared at the sketch, at the truth it carried, unable to speak. The coffee grew cold in his hand. He set it down slowly, afraid even the sound of the mug touching the table would break the moment. Emily shifted, nervous under his silence. Do you like it?" she asked quietly, her eyes wide, searching his face for an answer. He looked up at her, eyes glistening, though he refused to let them fall. Words failed him completely, caught somewhere between his chest and his throat, tangled in the ache of love and pride. So instead, he stood, reaching for her. The hug came fierce, almost desperate. He wrapped his arms around her small frame and pulled her close, pressing his face into her hair. She giggled softly, muffled against his chest, then felt the slight tremor in his breath and knew it wasn't just a hug. It was a thank you. It was I love you. It was I see you. When he finally pulled back, he held her by the shoulders, his eyes red but steady. "Emily," he whispered, shaking his head like he still couldn't believe the weight of what she'd given him. "You have no idea." His voice cracked, and he laughed softly, brushing a hand over his face. "This is the best gift I've ever gotten." She beamed then, relief and joy flooding her features. "Even better than the necklace?" she teased, tilting her head. He glanced at the box on the counter, the gold heart tucked safely inside. "The necklace is precious," he admitted, his voice firm, honest. "But this truth?" He held up the framed drawing, glitter catching the sunlight, words shining brighter than any jewel. "This is priceless." Emily's smile stretched wide, her cheeks glowing with pride. She leaned into him again, and together they sat at the small kitchen table, the framed sketch between them, the smell of bacon still in the air. Outside, the city moved in its usual rush, but inside their little apartment time slowed. The necklace carried weight, yes, but the drawing carried legacy. And in that moment, David knew that his daughter understood something people twice her age never learned. Worth isn't in what sparkles under glass, but in who stands beside you when the world tries to tell you otherwise. Weeks slipped by, carried in the rhythm of school days, dinners at the kitchen table, and evenings that ended with the soft glow of a lamp over Emily's desk. The necklace didn't sit forgotten in its box, nor did it become something she flaunted. It lived in the in-between, part of her life but not the center of it, a quiet reminder she returned to whenever the world felt heavy. Her father had insisted she not wear it to school every day. It was too valuable, too delicate. But often before heading out the door, she'd lift the lid, touch the cool heart with her fingertip, and let its shimmer steady her. It wasn't the gold she was reaching for. It was the memory it held. The moment she realized her father's voice could be louder than a room full of strangers, not in volume, but in truth. At school, something inside her had shifted. She no longer tucked herself into the edges of the hallway, no longer walked with her shoulders curved inward, as though the world would shrink her down if she let it. It wasn't that the other kids suddenly changed. It was her. When the art teacher announced that the after-school club was accepting new members, Emily's hand went up before she had time to doubt herself. The art room smelled of paint and sharpened pencils, the tables scarred with years of color and creativity. She took her seat quietly at first, sketchbook balanced on her lap, but soon her pencil began moving faster than her thoughts. She filled page after page, not just shoes now, but people, faces, hands, stories told in graphite and color. On the bottom of each page, she began to scrawl little notes, words she wished someone had whispered to her on the day in the boutique. You belong here. You are enough. Keep going. Her classmates noticed. At first they asked why she added words. She only shrugged, cheeks pink, and said, "Sometimes people need to hear it." Soon a few of them began slipping her drawings into their binders or pinning them to lockers. She never announced it, never drew attention to herself, but she saw the way her quiet lines rippled outward. She wasn't invisible anymore, but not because she shouted louder, because she gave something of herself that others recognized as real. At night, she shared pieces with her father. She'd spread her sketches across the kitchen table while he finished washing the dishes, and he'd dry his hands on a towel before coming over to study them. He never rushed. He looked at each one like it was worth more than the jewelry she had once been told she couldn't afford. "You see, people," he said one evening, tapping the corner of a page where she had drawn a classmate's nervous smile. "Not everyone does." Emily smiled quietly, but she didn't tell him what she had begun to see in him. That realization came slowly, building in her chest with every day that passed. He was still Dad, the one who packed her lunch, who nagged her about homework, who left his boots by the door no matter how many times she told him they made the hallway smell. But he was also something else. She saw him now as a man who had carried grief like a second skin, who had lost more than she could yet understand, and who still chose, day after day, to show up for her with love. She saw the tiredness etched into the corners of his eyes, the weight in his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking, and she realized that strength wasn't the absence of pain. It was the decision to keep moving through it. Sometimes, late at night, she would sketch him without telling him. Sitting at the table with his head bent over bills, or humming in the kitchen as steam rose from a pot, she would draw him not as the world might see him, but as she did, steady scarred, carrying both loss and love in the same breath. And she would add the words that felt truest of all beneath his image. Still here, still choosing. The necklace reminded her of that day in the boutique, but her father reminded her every day after. And together they were building something new, not just survival, but a story worth carrying forward. A new chapter written not in diamonds or chandeliers, but in sketches, in laughter, and in the quiet courage of being seen. The afternoon was warm, the kind of golden light that softened even the busiest corners of the city. David and Emily walked side by side, their steps unhurried as they carried grocery bags down the street. The rhythm of their routine was comfortable, familiar, until Emily noticed where they were. The boutique stood ahead, its tall glass windows reflecting the sky like a mirror. The sight of it made her chest tighten. She slowed, her sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk. David felt it instantly. He glanced down at her, then at the gleaming storefront. Without hesitation, he reached for her hand, his grip steady, grounding. "Want to go in?" he asked, his voice gentle, not pressing. Emily hesitated, chewing her lip. Memories flickered, the clerk's mocking tone, the heat in her cheeks, the shame of being told she didn't belong. For a moment she wanted to keep walking, to avoid the place altogether. But then she felt her father's hand holding hers, warm and certain. She nodded. Together they pushed open the glass doors. The boutique was the same, and yet not. Chandeliers still spilled soft light onto gleaming floors, and silk gowns still shimmered on mannequins posed like statues. But the air carried a different weight this time. The sharp edge of judgment was gone. A young associate at the counter looked up as the door chimed and greeted them with an open smile. "Welcome in," she said warmly. No glance at their shoes, no measuring of worth before offering kindness, just a simple welcome. Emily exhaled, the tension in her shoulders loosening. David squeezed her hand again, and this time she didn't shrink back. She stepped forward. They wandered slowly through the store. David let her lead, his presence quiet but near, like an anchor in a storm that wasn't raging anymore. Emily didn't touch the displays, didn't linger over the glass cases, but she didn't need to. She didn't come to want anything. She came to reclaim the space, to walk where once she had been humiliated and stand tall anyway. The necklace rested hidden beneath her shirt, the cool heart pressing lightly against her skin. No one in the boutique knew it was there, and that was the point. It wasn't proof of her belonging. It was a reminder that she never needed proof in the first place. The associate passed by again, arranging scarves, and gave Emily another smile, one that carried no weight but kindness. Emily smiled back, small but certain, her chin lifting just slightly. It wasn't defiance. It was peace. She paused near a row of dresses, not because she wanted one, but because the mannequins no longer looked like gatekeepers to a world she wasn't allowed in. They were just fabric, just shapes, nothing more. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror beside them. For the first time, she didn't see a girl with scuffed sneakers and mismatched laces. She saw herself, shoulders straight, eyes steady, hand held firmly in her father's. David caught her reflection too. He didn't say anything, but the pride in his eyes was clear, shining in the glass between them. They didn't stay long. There was no need. After a few quiet minutes, David gestured toward the door, and Emily nodded. As they stepped back onto the sidewalk, the air felt different, lighter. She breathed deeply, her lungs filling not with relief but with something else, ownership. She didn't belong because the boutique had changed. She belonged because she had. Her father gave her hand one last squeeze. She smiled up at him, and without words they both knew the truth. They hadn't walked back into the store to buy anything. They had walked back in to prove that worth never comes from chandeliers or marble or velvet. It comes from standing tall, from knowing who you are, and from never letting anyone tell you otherwise. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic bleeding in through the window. Emily sat at her desk, a lamp casting a warm glow over scattered pencils, scraps of paper, and a small cup of brushes. Her sketchbook lay open in front of her, and tonight the page was nearly filled. The drawing wasn't elaborate, not the kind of picture meant to impress teachers or hang in galleries. It was simple, deliberate, the kind of art that came from her heart instead of her hands. She had drawn 3 figures. On the left, a girl with sneakers carefully shaded to show the scuffs and frayed laces, but strong, planted firmly on the ground. In the middle, a father, tall, his hands steady and open, drawn with heavy lines that spoke of strength and quiet protection. On the right, A woman with a gentle smile, her hair sketched in soft strokes. Her mother, pieced together from fading memories and the stories her father still told on nights when Emily asked. Above them, in her neatest handwriting, she had written the words, "We were always enough." She stared at them for a long moment, her pencil resting loosely in her fingers. The phrase was more than something she believed now. It was something she needed to see every day, a reminder stitched into paper that no stranger, no clerk, no glittering boutique could ever take away again. She tore the page carefully from the spiral, the sound of the perforated edge giving way, filling the quiet. Standing on her tiptoes, she taped it to the wall just above her bed. The tape stuck a little unevenly, but that didn't matter. When she stepped back, the drawing seemed to glow under the soft lamplight, a banner of truth watching over her. The necklace sat on her nightstand, its velvet box open. The gold heart caught the light with every small movement of the room, gleaming as though it held its own quiet fire. She touched it once with the tip of her finger, not to put it on, not to test its weight, but just to remind herself it was there. A piece of the story she carried, but not the whole of it. Climbing into bed, she pulled the blanket up under her chin and turned onto her side, her eyes lingering on the sketch above her. The sneakers, the hands, the smile. Together, they told a story better than any she had ever read in a book. A story not about wealth or beauty or perfection, but about surviving, standing, loving. A story that was hers. Outside, the city was restless. Cars rushed past, horns blared, voices echoed off brick walls. Somewhere, music spilled from an open window, pulsing faintly into the night. The world roared on, loud and unrelenting. But inside her small room, the noise faded into a dull backdrop. The walls held warmth, the kind of warmth that didn't come from heaters or blankets, but from knowing she was safe, knowing she was seen. Emily closed her eyes slowly, her breathing evening out. For the first time in a long time, she didn't lie awake wishing she had different shoes, a different life, a different self. She didn't ache to be invisible, or small, or someone else entirely. She felt whole, not because of what sat in a velvet box, but because of what her father's voice had given her that day and every day since, the truth that she was enough. Sleep came gently, like a tide pulling her under. And as she drifted, the last thing she saw in her mind was her drawing. 3 figures standing together beneath the words she had written. A girl with sneakers, a father with steady hands, a mother with a gentle smile, a family. And in the stillness of that truth, Emily slept. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs the reminder that they are enough. Leave a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit subscribe, because more stories like this one are coming, stories that remind us of the quiet strength we all carry.